So we've been talking about the 1920s, and really the 20s are, known for the glamour and the partying and the money and all that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we didn't have our problems in the 1920s. We definitely did, and racism and discrimination were a big part of that. Those were definitely a big problem. Now, after World War I, like I've said, there's plenty of xenophobia going around, and nativism. If you don't remember what nativism is the belief that native-born Americans are superior to immigrants or naturalized citizens. Now, there are quite a few nativists in Congress during the 1920s, so we're going to see a lot of anti-immigration bills that do get pushed through Congress at this time. They're going to start by making it a law that you have to pass a literacy test in order to enter the United States. This is really difficult because not every country has the education system that we have, and especially in the 1920s, not everyone's literacy rate was as high as ours, and so we knew that not a lot of immigrants would necessarily be able to pass that exam, which is why we were giving it, because we wanted to limit the number of immigrants coming into the United States. In 1921, we passed the Emergency Quota Act, and this governs immigration from specific countries, setting quotas for each country, basically saying we're only going to take, this number of Japanese immigrants, and this number of Russian immigrants, and this number of Mexican immigrants, or whatever. And in 1924, we're going to limit immigration even more by passing the National Origins Act. And this bill said the number of immigrants of a given nationality each year couldn't exceed 2% of the number of those people living in the United States in 1890. So basically, if there were 100,000 immigrants living from China living in the United States in 1890, only 2% of that total number can enter the United States that year. So it's a very oddly written and sort of sneakily written bill, but it really, really limits the amount of immigrants coming into the United States. And if you look at that political cartoon on the left, you see this huge funnel where all these people from Europe are like trying to get into the United States, but we are really squeezing it down, and we're only accepting a few, like you see coming out at the bottom. Now, immigrants weren't the only people who are being discriminated against. Obviously, native-born Americans are also experiencing plenty of discrimination if they fall into a minority category. The 1920s is going to see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. So in 1915, a group of men in Georgia decided to revive the KKK, but now they're not just targeting African Americans, but Jews and Catholics and immigrants of all nationalities, and they're going to become very popular and powerful. And by the mid 1920s, they had 4 to 5 million members at their peak, which is a very large group. They're constantly fighting legally in and out of court all the time with different groups, because we've had time now for other groups to form and be able to defend themselves. The last time we saw the KKK was during the Reconstruction era, and really the only people who were going after the KKK were the federal government and the radical Republicans in Congress. But now time has gone on, and we've given more power back to a lot of the groups who had that taken away from them before, and now they're able to defend themselves more. So we're able to see groups like the NAACP and the ACLU and the Jewish Anti-Defamation League all battling the KKK along with the government. So one of the big things that the 20s is known for is definitely Prohibition. In 1919, the 18th Amendment is passed, which bans alcohol. Now, the 18th Amendment doesn't really have any punch behind it. It doesn't really have any enforcement to it, so we had to pass another act to actually enforce it, called the Volstead Act, Volstead. The Volstead Act, that actually enforces the 18th Amendment. So the goal is to strengthen the American family. Alcohol consumption does decrease during the era of Prohibition, and we wanted that because we didn't want, alcoholic parents to abuse their children, each other, lose their jobs. Alcohol leads to a lot of diseases and things like that. You can cause a lot of health problems. So all of that is sort of what we were trying to prevent or undo. So people who sold alcohol illegally were called bootleggers, people like Al Capone. I'll talk about him more in a moment, but anyone who's making and selling illegal liquor is a bootlegger. So speakeasies are places like secret clubs and stuff that you can go to and get a drink. And there are still some old speakeasies in places like New York and stuff. I know there's a place in New York where you can like go to the back of this bar and get a telephone booth, and if you like dial the right number, then the back of the booth opens up and it opens like into another part of the bar, which is pretty neat. It like used to be a speakeasy in the 20s. And it's really what's interesting about the Prohibition era is that it's really the first time that we see a law just so like openly defied by the general public. Now, even though alcohol consumption does decrease, the number of people drinking, the people who were determined to drink are going to drink regardless. And Prohibition just shows that you can't regulate morality with the law. It's really impossible. And this sort of is going to give rise to organized crime in the United States. Al Capone, like I said, is going to be the most famous criminal in this era, and he's going to get his start with bootlegging. So Al Capone was based out of Chicago. And he is an Italian crime boss, and Italian crime, organized crime, is known as Cosa Nostra. I've got that up there on the top of the slide, which means our thing in English. And so I know with the Godfather movie and stuff, we have this perception of the Italian mob being in New York, but really the Italian mob is everywhere. Cosa Nostra was a national thing. It was all over the place. So Al Capone was just one of the many mob bosses running an organized crime ring with Italian immigrants. And while bootlegging is the beginning, their actual crimes go far beyond that. They were involved in prostitution and drugs and gambling and robbery and murder, racketeering, paying off politicians, lots of different things. Finally, Al Capone will be arrested when he is caught on tax evasion. He was not paying any taxes. He kept declaring that he had no income when clearly he did. He was just making his income illegally. So he will be arrested. He goes to jail in Alcatraz for several years, but then eventually he gets really, really sick because he has syphilis, and his brain basically turns to mush because that's what syphilis does. It attacks your brain. And he dies not long after he does get out of prison. So, but that's not the end of organized crime. It's far from the end. Definitely not even the end of Italian organized crime. New York City alone, Cosa Nostra was run by the original 5 families. All 5 of those families still exist and are in business today. They're just way less powerful than they originally were. We've seen a big crackdown on organized crime in big cities like that. So a lot of those families have lost a lot of the power and influence that they've had previously, but that doesn't mean that they're gone. They're still out there. So pop culture is really the most interesting thing in the 1920s. We see a lot of different stuff, movies, sports, music, literature. Charlie Chaplin's probably the most famous movie star to come out of the 1920s. He was largely a comedian, a silent film star, movies like The Jazz Singer and stuff. Radio is going to be really important in the 1920s. It provides not only entertainment, but information. So sort of like television today. In sports, we've got people like Babe Ruth, who are hitting their prime in the 1920s. He was a baseball player for the Red Sox and the New York Yankees. Boxing is also going to be really big, especially for immigrants. People like Jack Dempsey were able to really become very well known and reach a lot of fame with boxing. It's easy to get into as an immigrant. It's not as hard as it might be to get into other sports. We're also going to see the first real celebrities coming out of the 1920s. People like Charles Lindbergh, who was the first pilot to cross the Atlantic on a nonstop flight. You see his plane there is called the Spirit of St. Louis. And while that's what makes Charles Lindbergh famous, it's not necessarily what he's always remembered for. His baby was also kidnapped, and it was one of the craziest crimes ever. His baby was held for ransom, and it was this whole thing about the Lindbergh baby was really popular. And the investigation into his baby's murder was definitely groundbreaking just in terms of forensics. So we're going to see a lot of fame for the Lindbergh family, not necessarily because of positive things. These ladies here in the middle, if you recognize their style, right, these are examples of flappers. So flappers were like young women in the 1920s, independent, didn't really care what society thought about them and their lifestyles, wanted to just like do whatever made them happy. They traditionally had short bob haircuts, wore shorter dresses than were traditionally worn by women, had a more boyish figure. It wasn't really about curves. In the 1920s, it was more of like a slender body type was the goal for a lot of people. Literature is a really big part of the pop culture in the 1920s. The authors of the 20s are known as the Lost Generation. And this is really emotional lost, I guess is what I mean, not necessarily physically lost. They're really disillusioned by all of this like glamour and partying and drinking and money that we see in the 1920s, but that lifestyle doesn't really come with any personal fulfillment and promise and purpose, and that's sort of what these authors were dealing with. People like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, you see a lot of those themes in Gatsby. If you've read it, if you're in AP, then I know that you've read it. Ernest Hemingway is another Lost Generation author. If you ever want to read any of his work, I suggest Hills Like White Elephants. It's just a really quick, it's only 4 pages. It's a very interesting read. And it really is a good example of that Lost Generation type of writing. But of all of the pop culture in the 1920s, a lot of it is inspired and comes from the Harlem Renaissance. So in the beginning of the 1900s, we see a large wave of immigrants coming from the Caribbean area, and they move to New York City and they live in Harlem. Along with those Black immigrants, we also see a lot of Black migrants moving from the South to the North during the Great Migration. And so Harlem is really going to be like the center of Black culture, and we're going to see this like rebirth of art and dance and music and literature and poetry and all sorts of stuff from the Black community, which is really cool. Marcus Garvey, this guy here on the right, was a civil rights leader in the 1920s, and he led something called the Back to Africa movement, where he was trying to convince African Americans in the United States to move back to Africa, to sort of like leave behind the oppression and segregation in the United States and start their own community. Some people do go with him, but he's really going to be important because a lot of his writings and ideas are going to be really influential to future civil rights leaders. Malcolm X is a good example of that. He was very much influenced by the writings and teachings of Marcus Garvey. The Harlem Renaissance is going to kick off the jazz age. Musicians like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday are going to be very popular. We're going to see a lot of Black authors coming to light. Langston Hughes wrote every type of thing you can imagine, poetry, books, all sorts of stuff. Claude McKay, who was a poet, a beautiful poet. Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God. You might have started reading that in AP English so far. So really the overall importance of the Harlem Renaissance is that it's really bringing African American culture to the front of American pop culture. It's really sort of like making what would have normally been part of Black culture before more mainstream. It's not just Black people who are listening to who are reading Langston Hughes's poetry. It's all types of people. It's not just Black people who are paying to go to a club and listen to Bessie Smith sing or Louis Armstrong play. It's white people also. So we're really seeing the like merging of these two cultures, which is going to be really important in terms of getting like overall respect and recognition for a lot of these artists.